Lucas had never believed in the supernatural, not really. He'd always been a man of reason, a night security guard at the sprawling, often eerily quiet, Woodgrove Hospital. Built in the early 1900s, Woodgrove had a reputation among the locals, full of whispered stories about its dark past and unsettling occurrences. Lucas, however, had shrugged them off as nothing more than urban legends until that night. His shift began as usual at 10 p.m. The hospital was under renovation, which meant fewer staff and even fewer patients, confined mostly to the newer wing. Lucas's job was to patrol the old wing, which, due to the construction, was mostly empty, save for the dust-covered remnants of medical history. The night was stormy, rain lashing against the old windows, thunder rolling in waves. Lucas started his rounds with only a flashlight and his set of keys. As he walked the dimly lit halls, his footsteps echoed off the high, arching ceilings, the sound swallowed by the vast, empty corridors. Halfway through his first round, Lucas heard a noise, a soft, almost imperceptible whimper. It came from one of the old operating rooms. He frowned, pausing to listen. Hospitals have their noises, he reminded himself, but this sounded different. Curious, he pushed the door open slowly. The room was empty. No surprise there. Yet, the temperature dropped sharply as he stepped inside. Lucas shivered, rubbing his arms, his breath visible in the air. He aimed his flashlight around, the beam flickering across old, rusted surgical tools and an operating table stained with age. That's when he heard it again, a whimper, followed by a soft, pleading voice, "Help me." The voice seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Lucas spun around, his heart pounding. "Hello," he called out, his voice sounding strange in the silent room. No reply. He decided it must be the wind, or the building settling, or his imagination. He left the room quickly, closing the door firmly behind him. Continuing his rounds, Lucas tried to shake off the feeling of unease. As he passed the old maternity ward, he froze. Through the window of the delivery room, he saw a flicker of movement. His rational mind told him it was impossible, the area was locked up, no power, nothing that could produce movement. Yet, there it was again, a shadow passing across the window. Heart in his throat, Lucas unlocked the door. The room was as cold as ice, his flashlight beam unsteady as it crossed over the abandoned medical beds and dusty incubators. Then, suddenly, the faint sound of a lullaby filled the room, a haunting melody that seemed to come from an old, broken radio in the corner. Lucas knew that radio, it hadn't worked in years. He approached the radio, the lullaby growing louder as he neared. Reaching out, he touched it, and the music stopped abruptly. Lucas stood there, listening to his own ragged breathing, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when he saw the reflection in the glass of the incubator, a woman, dressed in a faded nurse's uniform, rocking back and forth as if cradling a child. Lucas spun around, but there was no one there. He turned back to the incubator, and the reflection was gone. Feeling a surge of fear, he left the maternity ward, locking the door behind him, the melody of the lullaby still playing softly in his ears. His mind raced with thoughts of the supernatural stories he had mocked. The night was far from over, and Lucas was beginning to understand that Woodgrove Hospital held secrets, secrets that crept out in the dark, secrets that whispered and cried in the abandoned wards. He decided to avoid the lower levels, known amongst the staff for being particularly unsettling, but his route took him past the entrance to the basement. As he approached, the air grew colder, a chill that seeped into his bones. The door to the basement, which he knew had been locked earlier, was now ajar. Hesitating only a moment, Lucas pushed the door open and peered down the dark staircase. The smell of damp, rotting things wafted up to greet him. He shone his flashlight down the stairs, watching as shadows seemed to dance just out of reach of the light. Taking a deep breath, he began to descend. The basement was worse than he remembered. The air was thick, the silence oppressive. As he walked through the old records room, his flashlight beam fell on a pile of old patient files that had fallen to the floor. Curious despite himself, Lucas picked one up and flicked it open. The file was old, the ink faded, but he could make out the name, Eleanor Rigby, admitted in 1952. The details were sparse, the medical notes cryptic, mentioning only unusual symptoms and difficult-to-diagnose conditions. Lucas felt a shiver run down his spine as he flipped through more files, each as ambiguous and unsettling as the last. He placed the file back on the pile and was about to leave when a soft sobbing echoed through the basement. It was faint, almost lost beneath the sound of the storm outside, but unmistakably real. Lucas paused, his breath catching in his throat. The sobbing grew louder, more desperate. Compelled by a mixture of duty and fear, he followed the sounds to a heavy, rusted door at the far end of the basement. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, revealing a long-forgotten ward, the bed still made, the sheets covered in dust and grime. The sobbing was louder now, echoing off the walls, as if the room itself were crying. Lucas's flashlight swept across the room, stopping on a bed in the corner where the outline of a person could be seen under the filthy covers. "Hello," Lucas called, his voice trembling. The figure stirred, the sobbing stopped, and then, in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper, it said, "Help me, please." Lucas approached slowly, the air growing colder with each step. He reached out a shaking hand to pull back the cover, and as he did, the figure sat up. It was a woman, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow and dark. She was dressed in a patient gown, her hair wild and unkempt. She looked at Lucas, her lips moving, but no sound came out. Lucas stepped back, his mind racing. The woman seemed to fade in and out of visibility, like a bad signal on a television. He blinked, and when he opened his eyes, she was gone, the bed empty except for the dusty sheets. Heart pounding, Lucas hurried out of the ward, the door slamming shut behind him with a bang that echoed through the basement. He didn't stop to look back, didn't stop to think. He needed to get out, to get away from the suffocating darkness and the echoing sobs that seemed to follow him. As he ascended the basement stairs, the air gradually warmed, but the chill in his bones remained. He emerged into the lower hallway of the hospital, his body trembling, his mind unable to make sense of what he had just experienced. He decided he needed a break, a moment to collect his thoughts. He made his way to the staff break room, a small, brightly lit space that seemed like a sanctuary after the horrors of the basement. Lucas slumped into a chair, his hands shaking as he poured himself a cup of coffee. The storm outside had intensified, the wind howling against the building, the rain beating hard against the windows. Lucas watched the water streak down the glass, his mind replaying the night's events. He tried to rationalize, to convince himself there were logical explanations for everything he had experienced, but the woman's voice, the sobbing, the cold, they were all too real, too visceral to dismiss as mere figments of his imagination. His radio crackled to life, startling him. "Lucas, do you copy?" It was the voice of his supervisor, checking in as he did every few hours. Lucas grabbed the radio, his voice shaky as he responded. "Yeah, I copy. All clear." The sound of his name uttered so softly in such a desolate context chilled him to the bone. He knew he should turn and leave, forget his radio, forget everything and just get out. But the same pull that had drawn him to the morgue now held him fast. With a deep, steadying breath, he stepped into the room. The air was cold, colder than anywhere else in the hospital. His flashlight beam flickered as he moved it around the room, briefly illuminating the old, blood-stained operating table, the rusted surgical tools still lying scattered around as if hastily abandoned. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, dense and impenetrable. As Lucas moved further into the room, his foot kicked something on the floor. Looking down, he saw his radio. It lay just beyond the operating table, its casing cracked, the static noise it emitted adding to the cacophony of the storm outside. He bent to pick it up, his hand trembling. As his fingers closed around it, the whisper came again, louder this time, "Lucas, help me." It wasn't just a voice now, it was a plea, filled with such desperation and fear that it resonated deep within him. Lucas stood up, his eyes scanning the room, trying to locate the source. The voice seemed to emanate from nowhere, yet it filled the space, enveloping him in its sorrow. "Who are you?" Lucas called into the room, his own voice sounding strange and distant in the oppressive atmosphere. "What do you want from me?" No answer came, just the howling of the wind and the rattling of the windows as the storm intensified. Lucas felt a growing sense of dread, the weight of unseen eyes watching him from the shadows. He knew he should leave, but his legs wouldn't move, his entire body held captive by the haunting plea for help. His flashlight flickered again, then died completely, plunging him into darkness. Lucas fumbled with it, shaking it in a vain attempt to bring back the light. As he struggled, a faint glow appeared at the far end of the room. It wasn't strong, just a subtle luminescence that seemed to outline a figure standing by the back wall. Lucas, heart pounding, slowly approached the figure. As he drew nearer, the details became clearer. It was a woman, dressed in what looked like a nurse's uniform from another era, her features gaunt, her eyes hollow pits of despair. She looked at him, her lips moving slowly, repeating, "Help me, Lucas." He stopped a few feet away from her, the glow around her providing the only light in the room. "How can I help you?" he asked, his voice a whisper of fear and confusion. "Free me," she replied, her voice a melody of sadness and longing. "From what?" Lucas asked, although he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "From this place," she said, gesturing around her. "From the suffering, from the shadows." Lucas looked around, the outlines of the room barely visible in the soft glow. "I don't understand. How can I help?" "The key," she whispered, her eyes brightening with a flicker of hope. "Find the key, free us all." Before Lucas could ask more, the light began to fade, the woman's figure dissolving into the growing darkness. "Wait," he shouted, reaching out towards her, but it was too late. She was gone, and the oppressive darkness returned, thicker than before. Lucas stood alone in the dark, the woman's final words echoing in his mind. "Find the key, free us all." What key? Free who? The question spun in his head as he tried to make sense of the encounter. He needed to get out, to breathe, to think. He stumbled towards the door, his hands outstretched, feeling his way through the darkness. As he reached the hallway, the storm seemed to calm, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. But the hospital had changed for Lucas. It was no longer just a place of employment, it had become a place of mystery and sorrow, a puzzle he needed to solve. Determined now, Lucas set out to uncover the secrets of Woodgrove Hospital, to find the key, whatever and wherever it might be. His night shift had turned into something else entirely, a quest, a mission driven by the pleading of a spectral figure bound to the shadows. And as he walked the dimly lit hallways, the storm raging outside, he knew this was just the beginning. Lucas's resolve hardened as he wandered the echoing halls, driven now by a need to uncover the truth. The hospital's history, once mere background noise to his nightly duties, now beckoned with urgent whispers of untold stories and buried secrets. He remembered an old archives room, rarely visited, filled with records and old hospital logs. It was located in a less frequented basement area, not far from where he had experienced the haunting pleas. With the photograph in hand, Lucas searched for any more information that could guide him. Further digging in the folder revealed a hospital blueprint from the same era, highlighting a section of the building no longer in use, sealed off during one of the hospital's many renovations. Determined, Lucas made his way to the indicated area, an old wing that most had forgotten. He found it barricaded, the door sealed shut with heavy chains and a padlock. No ordinary key would open this lock, it was clear it hadn't been opened in years. The walls around were crumbling, the air stale and heavy. But Lucas was undeterred. Finding a heavy piece of metal debris, he began to smash at the padlock, his actions fueled by desperation and fear, each strike echoing through the deserted corridors. After several tense minutes, the padlock gave way, clattering to the ground. Lucas pulled the chains free and pushed the door open, coughing as dust billowed around him. The room beyond was dark, the air cold and unwelcoming. He stepped inside, shining his flashlight around. There, on the far wall, was the symbol from the photograph, a large key etched into the stone. Below it, an old, rusted box was embedded in the wall, a small keyhole in its center. Lucas approached, the spectral nurse's words echoing in his mind, "Find the key, free us all." His heart raced as he realized he didn't have the key. Frantically, he searched the room, finally noticing a small, metallic glint on the floor. It was a key, old and tarnished. Lucas picked it up, his hands trembling, and inserted it into the lock. It turned with a heavy, resounding click. The wall shuddered, and the stone around the key symbol began to move, retracting to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside, Lucas found a collection of objects, old medical tools, journals, and, at the very back, a book titled The Thresholds of Reality. As he pulled the book out, the air around him shifted, growing colder, the darkness seeming to pulsate. He opened the book, and as he read, the words seemed to lift off the pages, enveloping him in light. The whispers of the past, the cries of the trapped, the echoes of the forgotten, all swirled around him, their voices merging into one clear, resonant message: "Thank you." Lucas staggered back, the book clutched in his hand, as the light grew, filling the room, spilling into the hallways, cleansing the shadows. The spirits of Woodgrove Hospital, bound for decades to their suffering, were released, their presence fading with whispers of relief and peace. Exhausted, overwhelmed, but strangely at peace, Lucas exited the old wing, the early morning light beginning to seep through the hospital windows. The storm had passed, and with it, the dark veil that had hung over Woodgrove Hospital seemed to lift. The corridors, once filled with an oppressive silence, now echoed with the mundane sounds of a waking hospital, the distant beeps of medical equipment, the low murmur of nurses changing shifts, the soft footsteps of early morning visitors. It was as if the hospital itself had exhaled a long-held breath, releasing decades of pent-up sorrow and fear. Lucas walked through the hospital, his steps light, his heart still pounding from the night's revelations. As he passed the staff break room, he paused, glancing inside. The room was empty, the coffee pot half full, steam gently rising into the air. It was a normal scene, so ordinary it almost made him laugh. After everything that had transpired, the normalcy of a half-full coffee pot in a quiet break room felt almost surreal. With a deep, steadying breath, Lucas continued walking, making his way toward the exit. As he stepped outside, the first rays of dawn broke across the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the world. The hospital, with its towering structure, looked less like a haunted relic of the past and more like a beacon of hope and healing. But as he walked down the steps, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally shifted within him. He had crossed a threshold last night, not just in the hospital, but within himself. He had faced the unknown, the supernatural, and had emerged not just unscathed but transformed. He knew he would never be the same. The hospital would continue to operate, to heal and save lives, but for Lucas, it would always be the place where he had touched another reality, where he had freed lost souls and, in doing so, had freed a part of himself. The early morning air was crisp, refreshing, and as he inhaled deeply, Lucas felt a sense of closure. The shadows of Woodgrove Hospital had receded, giving way to light, both literal and metaphorical. He looked back at the building one last time, a soft smile playing on his lips. It no longer seemed daunting or eerie. Instead, it was just part of the landscape, a place where extraordinary things had happened, where the thin veil between worlds had been pulled back, if only for a moment. Lucas knew that the stories of the hospital would continue. Some would speak of its haunted past, others of its storied history of medical triumphs. For him, it would always be the place where he had encountered the unknown and had come out the other side, changed but whole. As he walked away, the sun climbed higher, and the hospital's walls glowed softly in the morning light. The day was beginning, full of promise and new beginnings. Lucas felt a profound gratitude, not just for the dawn of a new day, but for the night that had passed, for the darkness that had led to such unexpected illumination. The end of his shift marked not just the end of a long night, but the beginning of a new understanding, a new respect for the mysteries of life and death, of light and shadow. Lucas walked into the rising sun, ready for whatever came next, carrying with him the echoes of those he had helped to release, their whispers of thanks, a gentle murmur in his heart.